Howdy y'all, Brian S. Pratt here. So going to read chapter 2 of the third book of the Morcyth Saga entitled Warrior Priest of Dmon-li. And chapter 2, chapter 1, they were at the Fertilon estate in Corellian, where Nate's family lives. Nate, of course, is the slave that helped Miko in the slave mines of Sorna. And chapter 2 is them having to leave there and head back home. So, on to chapter 2. The next morning, the girl who had shared Jiron's bed the night before was no longer there. Jiron slept so peacefully, James almost didn't want to wake him. Almost. He and his girlfriend had awoken James twice during the night and had found it incredibly difficult to fall back to sleep while that was going on in the bed next to him. He got up and walked over to Jiron with a mischievous smile upon his face. Grabbing hold of his mattress, he upended it, spilling Jiron with a thud. After hitting the floor, Jiron got to his feet quickly with a knife at the ready. Looking around, he saw James with a mattress in hand. "Get up," James told him. "We've got a ship to catch." "What did you do that for?" he yelled, anger in his eyes. "For keeping me awake all night," he said. Actually, it should be he replied. He replied as he replaced the mattress. The anger quickly disappeared and a grin took its place. "Sorry about that. She was a randy one, she was." Returning to his bedside, he dressed. Jiron did as well. James noticed him putting his new clothes inside his pack and asked, "Taking them with you?" Jiron glanced over and nodded, saying, "Yeah, I think Teresa would like to see me in them." "You?" Shaking his head, he replied, "Green just is not my color." Jiron laughed. Once dressed and ready, they shouldered their packs and departed. James left behind the box of slugs. He already had enough, what with his belt filled and a small pouch of them within his pack. Out in the hallway, they turned toward the stairs and went up to Miko's room. Finding it empty, they checked Nate's room, where they found Miko saying goodbye to his friend. Now, the reason why James didn't take the whole box of slugs, okay, these are lead slugs, so a big box full of lead. I mean, that's just heavy, right? James don't want to cart that around. Sorry about that, but my girlfriend's making me drink water. She says I want to be healthier. "Come on, Miko," James told him. "We got to go." "Bye, Nate," Miko said when he went over and gave his friend a hug. Patting him on the back, Nate said, "You take care, Miko. Come back if you can." "I will, promise," Miko said as he fought rising emotions. The last week with Nate had been one of the best of his life. He really felt bad about leaving. "You take care of him," Nate said as he looked to James. "As best I can, you can rest assured." Jiron shook Nate's hand and then they left his room. Going back down the stairs, they made their way along the corridor toward the main door. On their way, they were stopped by Miriam, who gave them each a sack. "What's this?" Jiron asked. "It's traveling money," she explained. "My parents thought it an ample reward for saving their son." Give them each a heavy pouch containing a bulky heavy pouch. That sounds better than just a sack, right? "What's this?" James asked. "It's traveling money," she explained. "My parents thought it an ample reward. Thought it ample enough. My parents thought it an ample reward for saving their son." "There must be over 50 golds in here," Jiron said as he felt the sack. "Actually, 75. Michael just stared at the sack and that held pouch. Change one word, I gotta change them all, right? Pouch. Michael just stared at the pouch that held more coins than he had ever thought to hold. "Thanks," he said as he put it in his sack. "You're welcome," she replied, and then proceeded to give each a goodbye hug. When she got to James, she gave him a peck on the cheek and whispered, "From Meliana." Then to the others, "You better hurry. Captain Carroll won't like it if you keep him waiting." "We will," he said to her. "Say goodbye to Meliana for me. Next time I see her," she said. She said goodbye to both James and Miko with an extra special hug and kiss for Jiron. "Take care of yourself," she told him. "I will," he replied. "Come on," James said. "Let's go." She walked him to the front door. On the way, they saw Essen, who exchanged a handshake with Miko, and said goodbye. Walking down the street toward the dock, James said, "I hope this Captain Carroll won't have sailed without us." "I doubt it," replied Jiron. "He's doing it for Nate's family, so I think he would at least give us the courtesy of waiting a little bit." "How do you think it'll be? How long do you think it'll be before we're back in Cardri?" Miko asked. "Probably a couple weeks," James explained. "We're not going straight there, but are hitching a ride as they go along the trade route." Oh. Sails could be seen on the horizon as they neared the docks. Once there, they asked the harbor master which ship was Captain Carroll's, and he directed them to a two-masted vessel. "Thank you." Yeah, hang on a second. "Thank you," James said as they proceeded to the ship. When they arrived at the foam breaker, James hollered, "Permission to come aboard?" A man, obviously the captain by his dress, came to the gangplank and looked down at them where they waited on the dock. "Are you James?" James nodded. "That's me, and this is Miko and Jiron," he said, indicating the others next to him. Now, I've gotten some pushback from people about me not giving enough description, but I think certain words elicit a mental picture that you don't need me muddling up with trying to change that, right? Like when I say the captain, obviously the captain by his dress, right? So when you think, okay, captain there, he's dressed as a captain, who do you think of? Captain Jack Sparrow, Captain Barbossa. But yes, everyone's got the mental picture, and I prefer to have the reader's mind fill in the gaps than me trying to force their mind to change what's already there. "Are you James?" James nodded. "That's me, and this is Miko and Jiron," he said, indicating the others next to him. "Come aboard," the captain said before moving away from the gangplank. As they boarded the ship, the captain shouted orders to his crew, and the lines were cast off. The gangplank was pulled in, and the mainsail was unfurled. The ship began to move when the wind filled their sails. The helmsman turned the wheel, and the ship pulled away from the dock on its way to open water. "We appreciate you taking us on," James said. "You're welcome," he replied, in between barking orders. Turning his attention back to them, he said, "There's a room at the stern you can use. Cabin. On board a ship, it's called cabin. There's a cabin at the stern you can use while you're aboard. There's some goods stored in there too, sorry about that, but it's normally used as an auxiliary storage compartment." "Thank you," James said. "I'm sure it'll be fine." Nodding, the captain added, "Just stay out of the crew's way, and we'll get you where you need to go." "Which way is the stern?" Miko asked. The captain pointed to the rear of the ship. They headed in that direction and came to a door leading into the raised portion at the end. Opening the door, they found a small room half filled with boxes and bolts of colored cloth. "They must keep this stuff here so it won't be ruined by rain," suggested James. "Probably," Jiron said as they entered. Within, they found 3 hammocks, one slung above the other, hanging between the walls. Michael eyed them suspiciously when James informed him, "They're for sleeping." Michael went to them and said incredulously, "You're kidding." He took hold of the bottom one and pushed it. He just stared as it swung back and forth. "No, seriously," James said as he sat down on the middle one and proceeded to lie down. In tight quarters, such as on a ship, this is the only way to maximize space for the crew and still have plenty of space for the cargo. Eyeing them dubiously, he set his packs down in the corner. Michael came to the lowest one and opened it up, sitting down on it. Attempting to lie down, he suddenly flipped over backwards and landed on the floor. Jiron burst out laughing. James flashed him an annoying look, and he soon stopped. Turning his attention back to Miko, who had gotten up from the floor red-faced, he said, "It takes some practice." Hopping down from his hammock, he held Michael's open for him and said, "Here, sit down and lift one leg over." Michael hesitated a moment, but then came over and did as James said. Once he straddled the hammock, James said, "Now, lie back and nestle in between the sides. Once you're secure, bring your feet up together so you remain balanced." Nervous about hitting the floor again, Michael took it slow and laid back until he was nestled in the hammock. James kept a firm hold of it while he got in. Then, lifting his feet, he brought them into the hammock until he was completely settled within it. James let the hammock go, and it began swaying with the rocking of the ship. Michael panicked and tightly gripped the sides as soon as James let go, but soon realized that he was not going to immediately fall out. After a few moments of not falling, he began to relax. His nerves settled down, and he started to enjoy the swaying rhythm the hammock made with the rocking of the ship. Turning to Jiron, James asked, "Ever been in a hammock before?" Shaking his head, the knifer says, "Nope, never even seen him." "Want me to help you in?" "No, thank you. I'd just as soon sleep on the deck," he said as he made a space for him over in the corner. "Suit yourself." Going back to the door, he made to leave when he heard Michael holler, "Don't leave me in here!" Smiling, he went back and helped him to get out of the hammock. Taking Michael with him, he left the room and walked out on deck where the salt air whipping off the water almost knocked him over in its intensity. Gaining his balance, he moved to the edge of the ship by the rail where he gazed out over the water. Back behind the ship, the land was now only a thin line on the horizon. Everywhere as far as he could see was water, blue-green with a sky of crystal blue above them. He grinned, for he was always delighted to be on the water. Taking a ferry back home elicited the same reaction. It just felt good to have the wind whip around you with just the sound of the bow breaking the surf. He stood there quietly, mesmerized by the experience. That's me right there. I love being on a ship. And when I lived in Seattle all those years, taking a ferry was just the best thing. Because you get on the ferry, you get out of the car, you go up on the deck and just stand there in the breeze. Of course, in Seattle, you always wore a jacket on a ferry. Even in the middle of summer, you wore a jacket on a ferry because it was freezing cold. "We're making for Meriden, a city on the island near here," said the captain. "We have some cargo to unload and others to procure before leaving. We'll be spending the night at dock before lifting anchor in the morning." "Maybe we could do some sightseeing," James asked, turning around. "Might not be a bad idea," the captain agreed. "When we leave there, it will be 4 more days until we drop anchor again." "Anything worthwhile to see on the island?" "Not really. There are several nice inns if you want to take advantage of them while we're there. It's possible you may find something of interest, though my men tend to stay just on the ship while in port." "Thank you anyway, Captain." "No problem," he replied. "Just thought you might want to know." He then turned and climbed the stairs to the deck over the room where the helmsman stood at the tiller. James glanced up to Michael. "Do you want to do some sightseeing while we're there?" "Sure," he replied. "Better than being cooped up on the ship." Just then, a large creature similar in nature to a whale from back home suddenly crested the surface and fell back, causing water to geyser up into the air. "What was that?" Michael asked, wide-eyed. "Not sure," James answered. "Odd, but back home it might have been called a whale." "It was incredible," he said, as he gazed out across the water, hoping to see another. James looked out for another sighting as well, but he was really more interested in the serenity it brought him than trying to locate another of the creatures. He'd always found great peacefulness in watching the waves whenever he'd been on the ferry or charter back at home. By this time, the island they left had completely disappeared behind them. James remained by the rail until he began to see another island coming up ahead of them. My timer's going off. I'm not going to pause it. Anyway, it'll go for a minute. I apologize. But I don't want to start over. I haven't figured out how to splice these yet. Okay. "Looks like we're making for the island over there," as Jiron said as he came up behind them. "I think so too," James replied. "Michael and I are going to explore while we are in port. He said we wouldn't be leaving until tomorrow morning. Want to come along?" "Sure." They stayed at the rail as the island grew bigger and bigger. It wasn't long before they were able to make out the docks and other ships at anchor. The island itself was pretty populated. Houses dotted the landscape from one end to the other. Commands were shouted by the captain as he made ready to dock. The sailors furled the sails, and several went to the railing at the bow, readying lines to cast to those on the dock. With skill honed through the years of practice, the captain and his men slowed the ship as they approached. The sailors tossed the lines over to those on the dock. With quick speed, the dock workers wrapped the lines around mainstays, and they heard the dock groan as the ship pulled against the lines and came to a stop. Once the ship had stopped its forward momentum, the ship drifted backward, and the dock workers took up the slack in the lines until the ship was securely tied to the dock. The captain came to them and said, "You may disembark now. We'll be here for some time. Just be back by sunup." "Sure thing, Captain," James said. "That was sure something," Michael exclaimed. The way he brought the ship right up to the dock at just the right speed. The captain smiled at his exuberance and replied, "All in a day's work, me boy." He turned back to his men and began barking orders as they prepared the cargo to be taken off the ship. Shall we? Jiron asked, indicating the game plank a sailor had just put in place. "Absolutely," James replied, as he headed toward it with Michael just behind. When they disembarked, the first thing that James noticed was a lack of soldiers on the streets. There had been a small presence back in Corellian, but now there was a total lack of them. Guess the Empire doesn't feel the need for soldiers patrolling here, he observed. Probably not, agreed Jiron. Looking around, he saw not much more than houses and some stores. Doesn't look like there's too much to this place. Feeling a tug on his arms, James looked to Miko, who pointed to a bakery shop. James, tarts. Of course, tarts is the ongoing thing with Miko in all the books. James introduced them to him in the first book, and he had a passion for them ever since. I like tarts too. Smiling, he allowed himself to be dragged over to where they bought a dozen tarts with red berry filling. Michael paid for them from the money Miriam had given him, and then they left. James heard Michael licking his fingers and glanced at him. One tart had already bit the dust. They came back to where Jiron waited, and Michael handed him one. Ever had one before? Nodding, Jiron said, yeah, a couple times. Tersa really likes them. Moving along, they proceeded down the street to see what there was to see. They came to a woodcrafter who had several wooden ships displayed, and James went to inspect them. He picked up a small one and said, this would make a good present for Archie. The woodcrafter, seeing his interest, stopped the work he was doing on another of the wooden boats and came over. After some half-hearted haggling, James handed over the money and walked away with a small, single-masted ship. Putting it in his bag, he continued on. They spent the day sightseeing. Nothing real special was going on. James began thinking how nice it would have been to have Meliana with him. As they walked, they came to a craftsman working on ceramic figurines and saw a dolphin on display. After some haggling, he arranged to have it sent back to Corellian and to Nate's family's house. Why are you having it sent there? Jiron asked. Don't know where to send it to Meliana, so we'll send it to Miriam and have her take it to her, he explained. He wrote out a letter and gave it to the man with instructions on where to send it. Handing over the money, they left the shop and continued on. As the day progressed, the wind picked up and clouds formed on the horizon. Hope a storm's not coming in, he said. He commented. It could make for an interesting trip tomorrow. Michael looked to the clouds but didn't think too much of them. They don't look too bad. Not now, true, Jiron said, but they could make the ride choppy. When the day was almost over, they found an inn and everyone got their own room. Michael said he was tired of hearing them snore. After settling in, they met in the common room of the inn for dinner and entertainment. The bar was decent, but they couldn't understand all the songs as most of his repertoire was in the Empire's language. He did sing a few in the common tongue for those who spoke it. The next morning, when James woke, the wind-blown rain pelted the side of the inn. The floor was wet by the window from where rain had blown in during the night. Closing the window, he saw the dark clouds that blanketed the sky. The ships at anchor bobbed with the motion of the waves rolling in, and he looked with trepidation at the choppy water. Not at all the calm, placid scene of yesterday, and most likely would make for an interesting ride. He heard a knock at the door and turned toward it just as it swung open. Michael walked in, his pack slung over one shoulder. Seeing James at the window, he said, "Looks like the storm came in after all." "Yeah," replied James as he again glanced back out the window. "We better hurry before Captain Carroll sails." James grabbed his pack and they went out to the hallway where they found Jiron exiting from the room. "You see the storm brewing outside?" "Yeah," replied James. "It's going to make for a fun day." Giving James an odd look, he said, "Fun? I don't think so." I was being sarcastic. They made their way out of the inn and the wind drove the rain into them as they hurried down into the docks. By the time they reached the ship, the rain had succeeded in thoroughly soaking them. Racing up the gangplank, they were greeted by the captain who said, "About ready to send someone to go look for you." "Sorry if we're late," James said apologetically. "You're not going to sail on this, are you?" Michael asked. The captain broke into a laugh and replied, "It'll take more than a little storm to keep us at dock." Michael looked out to sea and saw the choppy waters and swallowed hard. He turned to James, who only shrugged. "You boys get on into your cabin." At the stern, the captain said, "We're casting off the lines now." Sailor pulled in the gangplank. The dock workers untied the ship and tossed the lines back to the crew. The captain began barking orders as his men hopped to comply. The ship turned slowly as it headed out to open waters. Once the ship was away from the docks, the captain hollered to the crew up in the mast, and the mainsail came down about halfway before they were tied off. The wind filled the canvas, and the ship lurched forward as it quickly picked up speed. Huddled in their room under the steering house, they began to feel the effects of the constant swaying of the ship upon the waves. James's stomach soured, and he said, I'm going to get some fresh air." "But you'll get soaked," Michael said from where he swayed in the hammock. He looked down at himself and replied, "I'm already wet." He opened the door and a gust of rain swept in before he managed to close it. Outside along the deck, he saw guidelines were now tied from bow to stern to help the sailors remain aboard in the storm. Grabbing onto one, he made his way over to the rail and put his face into the wind, which helped to settle his protesting stomach. He had never been seasick before, but then he had never been out in this kind of storm either. As they continued out to open sea, he searched for other vessels braving such a storm, but couldn't find any. He looked around at the crew. They didn't seem too worried, so he stopped his worrying about the weather. If the professionals saw nothing wrong, then he wouldn't either. The captain stood by the helmsman. Using the guide ropes to keep his footing, James made it to the stairs and climbed up. Made it to the steps. And climbed up. When the captain saw him on his way, he asked, "Everything okay?" Nodding, he climbed the last few steps and came to stand next to him, holding onto the rail. "Just out for some air is all." "Stomach bothering you?" the captain asked, grinning. "A little, but the fresh air is helping." The captain just nodded at that. "There doesn't seem to be too many other ships out in this," he mentioned. "Most don't want or need to be out in this, so they don't," he explained. "But if we just sailed in fair weather, we wouldn't get too far." "True." Oh, and there's a saying that always pops up in my games, my online games I play. It says, "A calm sea never made a good sailor," because obviously you don't get better if you're not challenged. He glanced down and saw Michael making his way along the guidelines. He hollered down to him until he got his attention, and then watched as he made his way up to where he and the captain were standing. When he reached the steerage deck, James noticed he was a little green. "Just take some deep breaths. That should help." Michael went to the side rail and tried to do just that, but his stomach rebelled. Bending over the railing, he lost the contents of his stomach as he retched into the water below. When it was over, he felt slightly better. From overhead, a sailor cried, "Captain! Sails! Where away?" The sailor pointed off to the left of the ship. "To port." They looked and saw a ship out there, heading in their general direction. "Imperial warship," the captain said, not too concerned. "Is that a problem?" "Unlikely," the captain replied. "It's most likely just on patrol." James didn't share the captain's nonchalance about sighting a warship. "Think he's looking for us?" Michael whispered as he leaned close to James. "I hope not," he replied as he kept an eye on the approaching ship. Now, everyone at the party the night before, I would assume, knew that James was headed back to Cardri. I'm sure the rumors circulated, right? And no one was keeping that secret. And they, so probably some discreet questioning by the authorities, if they knew that James was a person of interest, would divulge upon which ship he was going and where. So, how would they know? Did they know? I don't know. I didn't really think that through at the time. I just wanted some action, and so I threw a warship on the ship on there. But thinking about it, yeah, at the party they talked about them escaping the iron mines of Sorna, right, rescuing Nate, and so that they were people of interest. Nate was obviously in no shape. Nate was a slave, so he wasn't the one that did it. So it had to be these two people that caused everything, and so that's why they're going after him. And yeah, so just a little logic there. I like things that make sense. I don't want to just like something just out of the blue happens. I want it to make sense in the greater scheme of things. As time passed, the warship continued to close the distance between them, heightening James's worries. Suddenly, James heard the captain swear. "What?" he asked. Gesturing to the warship, the captain said, "They want us to furl our sails and be prepared to be boarded." "Is that bad?" James asked. A sailor on the other ship signaled with two flags. "Bad?" cried the captain. "With the waves crashing as they are, it's unlikely we'd survive. Our ships would be smashed together." "Then why would they want to?" The captain gave him an inquisitive look. "Why, indeed?" James turned to Michael and said, "Go get Jiron." When Michael had left, the captain said, "They know it to be risking a lot to link ships in this weather. They must want something or someone really bad and are willing to risk their ship to get it." James remained quiet as he glanced between the approaching ship and the captain. "Is there something I should know?" the captain asked. They probably want us. Thought as much, Captain Carroll said. I'm not going to endanger my crew or my ship. You understand that? Nodding, James said, yes, Captain, I do. Just then, Michael returned with Jiron, and James said, the warship means to board, and the captain says that doing so in this weather would most likely damage, if not destroy, his ship. Why do they mean to board? Michael asked. When he saw the look on James's face, he said, oh, us. James gave him an affirmative nod. What do you mean to do? Jiron asked the captain. I have to think of the safety of my ship, he explained. You need to get off. What? In this storm? He asked incredulously. I have no choice, the captain told him. If you're gone, they will leave us alone. James looked out to the choppy seas and said, that's a death sentence. We can lower you down in our dinghy, the captain said. At least that would give you some chance. So he's got a bunch of Jonas, right, on his ship, and they need to be getting up. That's what I kept thinking about this whole thing was the story of Jonah and other movies where they talk about Jonas. Yeah. But what about the warship? Michael cried out, realizing they'd be easy picking sitting in a small boat. Looking sad, but resigned to the situation, the captain said, not my concern, lad. All right, Captain, lower us in the dinghy. Now, I'm on the fence as to whether James would actually go along with this or not. He's a good guy, and the captain has done nothing wrong. So, does he want to risk damaging and destroying his ship, possibly killing crew for himself? I just don't think so. If you think I'm wrong, throw it in there. I mean, he could be a selfish son of a bitch and say, Captain, we're not going anywhere. And being a mage, he can enforce that. Of course, at the end of Dark Shores of Salvation, right? If James was in this position, he wouldn't have to get off the boat. He could take care of everything. But now, he's still inexperienced. He hasn't quite learned everything. Every time he does magic, he passes out. So, yep. Got to do what's right, right? Got to do what's right. And endangering the captain's ship on his behalf is not what's right. And he's got an odd moral code, but there it is. James, are you crazy? Michael exclaimed. We'll die. Turned to Michael, James yelled, if we stay, they'll all die with us. I'll not have innocent blood on my hands. Then softly, as if to himself, he said, I already have enough as it is. The captain hollered to a crew member standing nearby, who went over to the dinghy and, with the help of two others, prepared it to be loaded. Good luck to you, boys, Captain said. Sorry to have endangered your vessel, James replied. The captain just nodded. Grabbing a very unhappy Michael, he made his way down to the main deck where the dinghy was already on the other side of the rail, ready to be lowered. Coming to the rail, he climbed over into the waiting dinghy. Once he was in, he turned back and helped Michael. Jiron climbed in last, and they were in the benches. The sailors began to lower them down to the choppy water below. A sailor appeared at the railing. And tossed their packs to them. The ship rocked and the dinghy swayed in the lines. More than once it hit the side of the ship. James glanced up and saw the captain at the rail watching their progress. Spray soaked them, and as they neared the surface, waves crashed into them. Water filled the dinghy's bottom. Once the dinghy rested upon the water, James and Jiron released the ropes. The sea quickly took them and pulled them away from the ship. Waves crashed into them as the wind pummeled them with rain and spray. James looked back to the ship, and the gap between them widened rapidly. The captain still watched as they drifted farther away. The warship must have noticed them in the dinghy, for it changed its course slightly and bore down upon them. And that ends chapter 2. So they're adrift in a dinghy in a storm with a warship bearing down on them. You know, how bad can it get, right? But how would they know? You know, how would the people on the ship know at this point, right? How would the people on the boat know, on the warship, know that they were the ones in the dinghy, right? At this point, we don't know. So it makes you wonder how, because, you know, I don't think they had an actual, because if they just got information from the party, they wouldn't necessarily have someone on the ship, on the warship, probably wouldn't have seen them and know what they look like. So how would they know that those were them? I don't know. Well, I guess we'll find out in the next chapter, and I'll get to it, I'm hoping tomorrow. So I do have a question for everybody, if you happen to still be with me. Would it be better, since I'm doing this, is it better seeing me read it, or would you guys prefer if I like just have a still cover of the book as the picture while I'm reading it? I'm just curious. Anyway, that ends chapter 2, and we'll get to chapter 3 as soon as I can. Y'all take care.